The traffic light on River Street turned red, and that's the only reason Winston Vitale ever saw her. Across the intersection, a woman had gone down hard on the wet pavement, tipped out of her wheelchair, her papers scattering into the slush. People walked around her. A man in a good coat stepped over her book without slowing down. And she didn't call out, didn't wave anybody down. She just pressed her palms into the freezing ground and started dragging herself back toward the chair, 1 inch at a time, the way somebody does when she's had to do it before and nobody ever came. Winston had spent 11 years learning how to stay calm. He'd sat across from men who wanted him dead, and he hadn't once raised his voice. He ran the oldest family in New York on quiet alone, and there wasn't a door in this state his name couldn't open. But he was watching her hands now, and something in his chest was coming apart, because he knew those hands. 11 years ago, he'd made her a promise, the only one he'd ever made, and failed to keep on time, and then he'd disappeared without a word. He'd come back to keep it. He'd spent the last 12 months looking for her himself, and every lead had gone cold, unable to fathom how someone with his influence across the state had failed to locate one woman in this quiet corner of upstate New York. Now here she was, 30 feet away, hauling herself across a sheet of ice while the whole city walked past. The most feared man in New York sat behind bulletproof glass and cried like a boy, not because of the wheelchair, because of the timing, because he'd just done the arithmetic on those 11 years, and the number that came back wasn't one he was ready to hear. Whatever had put her on that ground had happened while he was gone. And the truth of it, the truth he wouldn't learn for another 3 weeks, would cost him everything he'd built. If a story about a promise kept 11 years too late is worth your time this morning, go ahead and hit like, share it with somebody who needs it, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let's get back to that red light on River Street. The light turned green, and Winston didn't hear the horn behind him. Theo Rowan called his name once from the driver's seat, then stopped. Because at 38, after 11 years of following this man, he knew well enough that once Winston Vitale opened a car door, no one could hold him back. He stepped out into the lane of cars, crawling slowly over the slick pavement without looking left or right, without caring that a small truck had to slam on its brakes barely a foot and a half from him. The driver rolled down his window, ready to curse, saw Winston's face, then shut his mouth and backed up. Winston crossed the full width of River Street in 7 long strides, and by the 4th he had already realized something that twisted his insides tight. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at anyone. Her eyes were fixed only on the wheel, as though the whole world had narrowed to the exact distance between her hands and that metal rim, as though expecting anything from another person was something she had given up a long time ago. He stopped an arm's length away from her. In his mind were 40 different ways to lift a person and move them somewhere safe. Methods he had learned during the years when he still had to carry people through the dark, and his hand had already reached halfway toward her when he froze. He didn't touch her. Instead, he did something Theo, watching from the car, had never seen him do for anyone in all 11 years, not even for the most powerful people in the state. He knelt down. The knees of his expensive dress pants sank into the filthy gray slush, cold water soaking through to his shins, and he never once looked down. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with hers, not even half an inch higher, and only then did he speak, his voice low and slow, the voice of a man who understood that if he raised it even slightly, everything would fall apart. "May I touch you?" She went still, not the stillness of someone paralyzed by pain, but the stillness of an animal that has heard something moving in the brush. Then she looked up, and Winston lived through the 2 longest seconds of his life. In the first second, her face was blank, carrying that polite exhaustion people reserve for a kind stranger. In the second, something passed through her eyes, so quickly it was like a door opening a crack and slamming shut again. And he knew with absolute certainty that she had recognized him, knew it the way a person knows they've been shot before the pain has had time to arrive. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask why it was him, didn't ask what he was doing there, didn't ask where he had been for the past 11 years. She did something worse than all those questions put together. She turned her face away, reached for the wheel, and began pulling herself up on her own. Winston remained on his knees. He wanted to help her so badly that his fingers trembled, but she hadn't given him permission. And suddenly he understood that if he touched her now, what he would take from her would be far greater than anything he could give back. So he waited. He waited as she put all her weight onto her arms, as she drew in one short breath through clenched teeth, as she lifted her hips off the pavement with the exact movement she had repeated thousands of times before. She got herself back into the chair. She adjusted her position, wiped her hands against the legs of her pants, and every movement was so neat, so practiced that it hurt to watch. Winston bent down and picked up the nearest thing lying by his feet. It was a book. One corner of the cover had peeled away, the spine had been worn smooth, and the pages inside had soaked up the melted snow until they had turned dark. He brushed the mud from the cover with the back of his hand, slowly, as though he carried all the time in the world in his pockets. Then stood and placed it in her lap. They both looked down at the book. Neither of them spoke for 4 breaths. Winston opened his mouth, and everything he had prepared over the past 12 months, every sentence he had rearranged in his mind through sleepless nights, vanished completely. In the end, the only thing he could manage was her name, Lana. Only then did she look directly at him, and there were no tears in her eyes, no anger, nothing at all except a calm that had been honed over years, the kind of calm he had only ever seen in people who had gone all the way to the end of something and come out the other side carrying no illusions with them. She placed her hands on the wheels. "Go home," she said, and her voice didn't tremble. "You made a promise to a girl who could still walk." Then she pushed, turned the wheels, and left. Winston didn't follow her. He didn't call her name a second time, didn't make her an offer, didn't tell her he had spent an entire year looking for her, because there was something in what she had just said that made every word he had planned to speak feel cheap. He stood in the middle of River Street, with mud staining both knees, watching her back grow smaller toward the far end of the block, watching those arms push her over the ice, slow and steady, without turning around even once. Behind him, a car honked, then another. Winston Vitale didn't move. The light changed 2 more times before he finally returned to the car. And when he sat down in the back seat, Theo saw something in the rearview mirror that he had never once seen in this man during 11 years at his side. Winston's hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "Home, sir?" Theo asked. Winston stared out through the window toward the end of the street, where there was no one left to see. "Find out where she lives," he said. Before dark, the bus stop on Hoosick Avenue had a shelter, but the roof leaked, and Lana had been sitting beneath it for 40 minutes. Route 11 was the only route in this neighborhood with a lowering floor and an access ramp, which meant that if it broke down, she had no second option, and this morning it had broken down. She knew because she had called the transit hotline at 7 o'clock, and a recorded voice had thanked her for her patience. When the bus finally arrived, the driver had to get out and kick the ramp by hand 3 times before it released, and he apologized to her with exactly 1 sentence. The same sentence she had heard so many times that she could have recited it from memory before he even opened his mouth. She didn't blame him. She didn't blame anyone, because blame wouldn't get her to work a single minute faster. On the bus, she opened the book in her lap and let it air dry. The pages had wrinkled and curled at the edges, and the ink in several lines had bled into gray streaks. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then closed it and slipped it into her bag, and during those 3 seconds, she allowed herself to think about the man who had placed it in her lap that morning, and then she stopped. Halloran Community Center stood at the corner of 4th and Congress, a 2-story red brick building constructed in 1921, and its only elevator had been broken for 3 months. A printed notice reading "Under Maintenance" was taped to the elevator door. It had been there since October, its edges curling upward and turning yellow. Lana had filed 2 complaints with the city council, both of them clearly citing the relevant provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, both of them automatically acknowledged by the system as received, and neither of them ever answered by a human being. She had stopped herself from filing a 3rd, not because she had given up, but because filing a complaint cost her an evening, and 1 evening meant 30 pages of audio transcription, and 30 pages of transcription meant $27. Her class was on the 2nd floor. At 6:15, Walter Grady unlocked the side door for her, just as he did every evening. 72 years old, a former steel mill worker. He had worked security there since retiring. He didn't ask questions. He didn't say a word. He simply locked the door behind her, pushed her wheelchair to the foot of the stairs, set the brakes, then crouched down in front of her with his back turned. Lana wrapped her arms around his shoulders. He rose using his knees, slowly and steadily, exactly the way he had done every evening for the past 3 months, then climbed 22 steps, pausing for 1 breath at the landing before continuing. At the top, he lowered her into an old office chair with the armrests removed, went back down, carried the wheelchair up with both hands, and reassembled it piece by piece. The whole thing took 7 minutes. Neither of them had ever called it a procedure. At 6:30, 11 students came into the classroom. The youngest was 23. The oldest was 68. There was a woman who worked the night shift at a warehouse, an unemployed house painter, 2 people recently released from prison and still on probation, and a man named Dale Prentice, 54 years old, who had driven a forklift at the Port of Albany for 29 years. Dale couldn't read. He had hidden it his entire life by asking his wife to fill out paperwork for him, by saying he had forgotten his glasses, by memorizing the shapes of the words on signs instead of reading them. His wife had died the year before. Lana had been teaching him for 8 weeks. That evening, she placed a blank sheet of paper and a pencil in front of him and didn't say anything. Dale held the pencil in his whole fist as though it were a hammer, and he wrote the letter D, then the letter A. He stopped for a long time at the letter L, his hand shaking so badly that the pencil stroke broke into 2 separate lines. Then he kept going until he reached the end. Dale Prentice, 13 letters. He looked at the paper, then he put the pencil down, then raised both hands to cover his face and sat there like that, and no one in the classroom said a single word. The woman who worked the night shift, sitting at the desk beside him, reached across and placed a hand on his shoulder. Lana didn't go to him. She stayed where she was, both hands resting on the table, and let that moment belong to him. At 9 o'clock, class ended. Walter carried her downstairs on his back, put her wheelchair back together, and locked the door. He handed her half a box of cookies his wife had sent, the same box he offered her every evening, and the same one she accepted every evening. Then stood on the steps watching until she disappeared around the corner, just as he always did. Outside, the snow had crusted over into ice again. Lana pushed herself along the edge of the sidewalk, avoiding the sunken patches, and at the intersection with 4th, she had to go an extra block out of her way, because the curb ramp there had been broken since the previous winter. She reached her building at 9:40. A man was standing on the front steps waiting for her, and it wasn't the man she had expected. It was Ray, the building manager, and he handed her a sheet of paper folded in half. "Someone came by asking about you this morning," Ray said, lowering his voice even though there was no one around. "Not the police. I didn't tell him anything, Miss Bennett, but I think you should know he didn't need me to. He already knew your apartment number." Lana took the paper but didn't open it. She thanked Ray, waited until he disappeared into the manager's office, then slipped it into her coat pocket and wheeled herself into the elevator. Because this building at least had one elevator that worked, and that was the only reason she stayed here, even though the rent was $180 higher than it was across the river. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. She unlocked the door and heard the television playing an antiques auction program at full volume, and Grandma Nora was sitting in her armchair with her back to the door. "Grandma, I'm home." Grandma Nora turned around. She was 76, her silver hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, and her face lit up with genuine happiness, the kind of happiness that told Lana exactly what was coming next. "Margaret," she said, "you've been gone so long. I've been waiting for you to have dinner with me." Margaret was Lana's mother. Margaret had died in 2009. Lana had learned that arguing was both useless and cruel, that dragging someone back into reality only frightened them for exactly 30 seconds before they forgot again, and that each time it happened, they seemed to lose a little more of themselves. So she wheeled herself beside the chair and took her grandmother's hand. "I've already eaten, Grandma. Have you eaten yet? You always say you've already eaten." Grandma Nora patted the back of her hand, gently reproachful. "You're too thin. Your father says you work too much." There was half a container of chicken soup left in the refrigerator. Lana warmed it up and fed her grandmother one spoonful at a time, while the television program moved on to a grandfather clock valued at $400, and Grandma Nora remarked that the clock wasn't worth anywhere near that much, and for those 2 minutes, she was entirely herself. Then she turned to Lana and asked how little Lana had been doing lately, whether she still called home often. Lana lifted another spoonful of soup. "Yes, she still calls." At 9:30, Grandma Nora went to bed. Lana checked the blister packs of medication, marked the calendar taped to the cabinet door, turned off the light in her grandmother's room, then went back to the dining table and switched on the only lamp in the apartment that was still burning at that hour. There was a stack of mail on the table. She pulled out the newest statement from Samaritan Medical Center, billing department, and looked at the number on the final line. $61,240. That was the portion insurance hadn't covered after the deductible, plus 2 spinal surgeries, plus 11 weeks of rehabilitation that the doctor had said were mandatory and the insurance company had said were not medically necessary. She was paying $400 a month. At the current interest rate, she had already done the math. She would finish paying it off when she was 47, assuming nothing else broke, assuming Grandma Nora didn't have to be hospitalized again, assuming this wheelchair lasted another 6 years, even though the manufacturer recommended replacing it after 5. Lana folded the bill and set it down. and she didn't allow herself to sit still for too long afterward, because she knew exactly what would happen if she did. She opened her laptop, plugged in her headphones, and opened the next audio file in the queue. Transcription work paid $27 for each completed hour of audio, and 1 hour of audio took 4 hours to transcribe if the sound quality was good, and the sound quality was never good. Tonight's file was the record of a school board meeting in the neighboring county. 17 people talking over one another, with someone's phone vibrating against the tabletop for 40 straight minutes. She typed 10:30, 11 o'clock, midnight. At around 1 in the morning, her fingers began to stiffen, and she stopped, rubbed her hands together, then kept going, because her hands were the only part of her that could still earn money, and she treated them the way a person treats a tool when there is no second one to replace it. At 2 in the morning, she saved the file and sent it off. Then she sat there in silence, and at last she took the paper from her coat pocket and opened it. There was only one handwritten line, the letters slanted and firm. "I won't come if you don't want me to, but I need to know you're okay." There was no signature, no phone number. Lana read it twice, then folded it along the exact same crease as before, and wheeled herself into the bedroom. Against the wall stood a low dresser. She pulled open the bottom drawer, the one that was hardest to reach, the one she had to lean sideways and brace one hand against the dresser just to open. Inside, at the very bottom, was a yellow A4-sized envelope, its edges worn and softened by time. Lana placed Winston's note on top of it. Then she laid her palm over the envelope and held it there. She didn't open it. She hadn't opened it in 5 years, and she knew every word inside so well that she didn't need to, and she knew that as long as she didn't open it, everything would remain exactly where it had been, safe, arranged, settled, already decided. Her fingers tightened slightly against the paper. Then she drew her hand away, pushed the drawer shut with her whole arm, and the sound of the drawer clicking into place was the last sound in the apartment that night. That same night, 4 blocks from River Street, inside an abandoned warehouse along the edge of the Hudson River, 7 men were waiting, and not one of them sat down. The warehouse had belonged to the Vitale family since before Winston was born, back when it was still used to store actual cargo, and now it was opened only on nights when something needed to be brought to an end. People called the Vitale family the oldest family in New York, not because it was the largest, but because it was the only one that had remained intact through 3 waves of federal prosecution over 40 years, and people said the reason it had survived intact was that the man at its head never left behind any noise. Winston Vitale arrived at 11 o'clock that night. He had changed his clothes. There wasn't a trace of mud left on his knees, and he entered through the side door without greeting anyone, and every man standing inside fell silent. In the middle of the warehouse, a man named Frank Ludlow was kneeling on the concrete floor. 41 years old, 14 years working for the family, responsible for 4 restaurants in the northern part of the city. 3 weeks earlier, Frank had met with an attorney from the United States Attorney's Office at a coffee shop in Latham and talked for 22 minutes. No one had touched Frank that night. No one had tied him up. No one had beaten him, and that was exactly what frightened him so badly that he couldn't stand. Winston pulled out a wooden chair, sat down across from him, and said nothing through a silence so long that Frank began speaking first, stammering that he hadn't told them anything, that he had only listened, that he had a daughter in her 2nd year of college. Winston let him finish. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a ring of keys on the wooden table between them. The keys to Frank Ludlow's house, the house on Vandenberg Street, the one Frank had finally paid off the mortgage on the previous August. Frank stared at the keys and stopped breathing. "I know what you said," Winston said, his voice still as low as it had been when he spoke on the street that morning. "And I know what you didn't say." He pushed the keys toward Frank with 2 fingers. "Your wife has nothing to do with this. Your daughter has nothing to do with this. You have 2 weeks to leave this state, and no one will follow you. But if you come back, I won't speak to you a second time." That was all. 3 sentences. Then Winston stood, and Frank Ludlow, a 41-year-old man who had spent 14 years in this world and thought he knew every way a thing like this could end, collapsed onto the concrete and began to cry, sobbing out loud, both hands clutching the keys to his own home as though he were holding something that had just been returned from the dead. Not one of the other 7 men dared to look at him. Winston walked toward the door. There, leaning against the iron doorframe, Julian Ferraro had watched the entire thing from beginning to end. 58 years old, wearing a gray wool coat, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Julian was the man who had taken Winston into his home when Winston was 12, after his father died in something no one spoke about even now. And in 46 years of living in this world, Julian had never raised a hand against anyone. He gave Winston a light pat on the back as he passed. "You did the right thing," Julian said. "Your real father wouldn't have done it that way. He would have chosen the faster and stupider way." Winston didn't answer. They walked out to the parking lot, two men in the freezing cold, and Julian turned up the collar of his coat. "Theo told me you got out of the car in the middle of River Street this morning," he said, without reproach, in the voice of a father simply asking after his son. "It was her, wasn't it?" Winston stopped. "Yes." Julian was silent for a long time. Then he lifted a hand and gently squeezed Winston's shoulder. And when he spoke, his voice was genuinely thick with emotion. "I looked for that girl for 4 years, you know that. 4 years. I had people search from Troy all the way down to Poughkeepsie. I hired 3 different private investigation firms. I paid people at the Vital Records office. I had no business paying, and there was nothing. Every trail went cold." He shook his head. "I started thinking she'd moved to another state. Or worse." He squeezed Winston's shoulder once more. "I'm glad I was wrong." Winston looked at him. Beneath the parking lot lights, Julian Ferraro's face was the face of the only man in the world who had raised him, who had taught him how to sit still, who had taught him that the strongest man in the room was the one who didn't need to raise his voice. Winston nodded once. "Thank you." Then he got into the car. Theo drove away, and on the way home Winston sat in silence, staring through the window, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Julian's words kept circling in his mind. 4 years. Every trail went cold. And Winston, searching with his own hands, had needed 12 months and found her because of a red light. He raised a hand to the back of his neck and rubbed it. There, just beneath his hairline, was a raised scar, about 1.5 inches long, faded with the years. He touched it out of habit, a habit he couldn't remember ever beginning. And just as he did every other time, he tried to remember where it had come from. And just as he did every other time, he couldn't remember. Theo Rowan had placed the sheet of paper on Winston's desk at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, less than 9 hours after Winston had asked for it. On it were her full name, the address of the building on 9th Street, her apartment number, the name of the building where she taught, the time her classes began and ended, and the bus route she took. Theo had found it all with 3 phone calls and 1 visit to the state office that handled adult education teaching licenses, where every instructor's records were kept publicly, and anyone could look them up if they knew how to ask. Winston stared at the paper for a long time. Then he asked a question he himself didn't understand why he was asking. "Was this hard to find?" Theo frowned slightly. "Not at all, sir. Her name is in the state's instructor directory. Once you know what she does for a living, she's easy to find." Winston folded the paper and said nothing more, but something small and cold had just settled inside his chest, and he didn't yet have a name for it. At 7 o'clock the following evening, he stood outside apartment 307. He had been waiting in the hallway since 6:30 because he didn't want to knock while the old woman was sleeping, and he heard the television inside go quiet before the door opened. Lana didn't open it all the way. She opened it only as wide as her shoulders, one hand gripping the knob, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had known this would happen and had already had time to prepare for it. "My grandmother is asleep," she said. "Keep your voice down. I'm not coming in." "Good." He stood there. The hallway was narrow. One of the ceiling lights was flickering, and the man no one in the entire state dared interrupt couldn't find a sentence to begin with. "You didn't answer my note. You wrote that you wouldn't come if I didn't want you to," Lana said. "I didn't answer. That meant I didn't want you to. You came anyway." Winston took the blow without blinking. "I know." Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a small, faded cardboard box, the kind little jewelry stores in Troy still used 20 years ago, and opened it in front of her. Inside was a thin gold ring with no stone, its outer edge worn smooth in 2 places, from years of rubbing against the inside of a pocket. "I bought it with my first month's pay," he said. $310. I paid it off over 7 weeks. Lana didn't look at the ring. She looked straight into his face, and that was what made this so much harder. "You've carried it for 11 years? For 11 years. So how many cities have you carried it through, Winston?" she asked, her voice soft, almost curious. "Did you ever take it out? Ever set it on a breakfast table somewhere and think, not this week, maybe next week?" He didn't answer. "I'm really asking," Lana said, "because I waited too. I waited for the first 2 years like an idiot. Then I stopped. And do you know what's frightening? Stopping is a lot easier than waiting." Winston still held the box open in his hand. "I didn't come here to make excuses." "Then what did you come here for?" "To keep my promise." That was when her face changed. It didn't soften. It hardened in a different way. And for the first time during the entire conversation, she lowered her eyes to the ring. She looked at it for a long time, and for those 3 seconds, something very young and very wounded moved through her eyes before disappearing. "Put it away," she said. "Lana, that ring belongs to someone who died 5 years ago." She looked up. She was 24 years old. She taught evening classes and walked home, and believed someone was coming back for her. "If you want to marry her, go find her. She isn't here. You're standing right here." "No," Lana said. "This is what's left." Winston didn't move. He didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't put his foot in the doorway, because there was one thing he had learned very early in life. Once a person managed to say something like that out loud, every word that followed only forced them to defend it harder. So he simply closed the box. "All right," he said, and Lana closed the door. She closed it gently, without slamming it, and the sound of the latch catching was very small, and she remained on the other side with both hands resting on the rims of her wheelchair, unable to push herself away, and she sat there for 4 minutes in the darkness of the living room before telling herself she had done the right thing. Outside, Winston didn't leave. He looked at the number 307 on the door for a while, then took off his coat, folded it, placed it on the tiled hallway floor, and sat down with his back against the opposite wall. He didn't knock again. He didn't call. He simply sat there with the small box in the palm of his hand beneath the flickering light, and he stayed that way all night. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a man leaving for an early shift came out of the apartment at the end of the hall, saw him, and immediately quickened his pace and kept walking. At 6:15, sounds came from inside apartment 307. The kettle, the television switching on. Winston stood, his body stiff with cold, put on his coat, and went downstairs. He left nothing behind. But when Lana opened the door at 7 o'clock to collect the local newspaper, the building still delivered, she saw a clean rectangular patch on the tile across from her door amid the dust, exactly the size of a folded coat, and she stared at it for a long time before turning her wheelchair back inside. Lana worked more than usual that entire day. She accepted 2 additional audio files, even though her queue was already full, cleaned the kitchen again, rearranged the medicine cabinet by expiration date even though she had done it the week before, and she did every one of those things with the very clear awareness that she was doing them, so she wouldn't have to sit still. That evening, she went to class anyway. Walter carried her upstairs, carried her back down, and asked no questions, though at the foot of the stairs he did look at her a little longer than usual. She got home at 9:40, checked the medication, turned off the light in Grandma Nora's room, and sat down at the table. She typed until well past midnight. Around 1 o'clock, she heard the bedroom door open. Grandma Nora was standing in the doorway in her slippers, and Lana turned with the sentence already prepared about how she ought to go back to bed. Then she stopped, because Grandma Nora was looking at her. Not the kind of glance that touched her and drifted somewhere else. Not the look of someone searching for a face through fog. She was looking straight at Lana, and all 76 years of her life were there in her eyes. "Lana," she said. Lana took off her headphones. "Couldn't you sleep, Grandma? I heard you talking to someone outside the door last night." Grandma Nora came closer, slowly. One hand braced against the back of a chair, and sat down in the chair beside the dining table. "I wasn't asleep. I was just lying still." Lana didn't know what to say. Over the past 5 years, moments like this had come less and less often, each one shorter than the last, and she had learned that asking more questions couldn't make them last longer. Grandma Nora reached out and took her hand. Her hand was cold and light, but her grip was firm. "It was that boy from back then," she said. It wasn't a question. Lana stayed silent. "I remember him," Grandma Nora said. "He used to stand outside the fence waiting for you. He was too afraid of me to come inside. He was skinny as a rail." She tightened her hold on Lana's hand. "You sent him away, didn't you?" "I had to." "Why?" "Because he won't be able to bear it, Grandma." Lana heard herself say the words and was surprised by how softly they came out, like a sentence she had memorized. "He'll stay for a few months because he feels sorry for me, and then one day he'll look at me and see everything he had to give up because of me, and by then it'll be too late for both of us. I know how it'll happen. I've already thought through all of it." Grandma Nora looked at her for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice low and clear, each word separate. "You don't have the right to decide for that man what he can carry." Lana started to open her mouth. "You took his choice away from him," Grandma Nora continued, without a trace of anger. "And that was exactly why the words cut so deeply. Then you called it sacrifice. There was nothing more after that." She released Lana's hand, patted the back of it twice, then stood up and walked back to her room on her own. And Lana remained where she was, listening to the bedroom door close. She didn't type another word that night. She sat in front of the glowing screen until it turned itself off, then sat in the darkness for a while longer. At 6:15 the next morning, Lana got up earlier than usual. She had been thinking all night, and she had decided she would ask her grandmother about it. Ask her to explain what she meant. Tell her even the things she had never known, because for the first time in 5 years, Lana had someone she could talk to. She made coffee. She poured 2 cups. She heard slippers in the hallway and turned her wheelchair around. And she had already opened her mouth to say, "Grandma," when Grandma Nora stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Lana, then she looked at the 2 cups of coffee on the table. Then she looked back at Lana, and on her face was a cautious, polite confusion. The expression of someone who had just found a stranger inside her home and was trying not to show that she was afraid. "Who are you?" she asked. "Are you the caregiver? My family didn't tell me anyone was coming." Lana couldn't answer at first. She sat there with both hands resting in her lap. And for those 3 seconds, she felt the whole of the previous night being pulled out of the world, as though it had never happened at all. "Yes," she said at last. "I'm here to help you this morning." "Oh." Grandma Nora nodded, visibly relieved. "That's good. Would you like some coffee? I made some." She pointed to the 2 cups Lana herself had just poured. "My husband will be home in a little while. He went out to get the newspaper. Her husband had died in 2003. "Yes," Lana said. "I'll wait." She waited until her grandmother sat down, waited until she picked up her cup, waited until she turned toward the window and looked outside the way she did every morning. Then Lana quietly backed her wheelchair away, rolled into the kitchen, turned her face toward the sink, and opened the faucet so the water would run. That was how she cried, without making a sound, both hands gripping the edge of the sink, her shoulders trembling in short waves, while behind her, the woman who had spoken the truest words Lana had heard in 5 years, drank her coffee, and waited for a man who had been dead for 23 years to come home with the newspaper. 3 days later, Lana arrived at Halloran Community Center at 6:15 and found the side door already open, with the sound of a power drill coming from somewhere inside. Walter stood at the foot of the stairs with the keys in his hand, and he didn't crouch down the way he did every evening. He simply nodded toward the far end of the hallway. The notice taped to the elevator door was gone. The doors were open, and inside, 2 technicians were reinstalling the control panel, while on the floor sat a crate of parts, still bearing the factory seals from a company in Albany. Outside the main entrance, the ramp leading up to the front steps, the concrete ramp that had been missing 1 corner since the previous year, and was so steep that Lana had always needed someone to push her, had been torn out completely. In its place now stood new wooden framing, half again as wide as the old ramp, with handrails on both sides, and even a level landing midway up. One of the workers told her they would pour the concrete the next morning, that the entire job had already been paid for in advance, and when she asked who had paid for it, he only shrugged and said he just took orders from the contractor. Lana didn't need to ask anything else. She went upstairs by elevator that evening, for the first time in 3 months, and during the 40 seconds it took to travel from the first floor to the second, she sat there feeling something she couldn't name, something that felt like relief and exposure at the same time. At 9 o'clock, class ended. She came out of the building and saw him standing across the street by the curb beside the black car, both hands in the pockets of his coat. Lana wheeled herself straight toward him. "How much?" she asked. Winston didn't answer. "I'm asking how much it cost." "That doesn't matter. Not to you." Her voice rose, and she heard it rising, and she couldn't stop it. "Do you know how many complaints I filed about that building?" 2. I cited the law in both of them. The actual sections. Nobody answered me. Not one person. Then you show up, and 3 days later everything gets fixed, and I have to stand there while people ask me who I am, that I know someone like you. Her hands tightened around the rims of her wheelchair. "I don't want favors, Winston. I'd rather climb those stairs on Walter's back for the rest of my life." "I know. You don't know anything," she said. "You think you can buy back 5 years with an elevator?" Winston looked at her for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice no louder than before. "I didn't fix it for you." Lana stopped. "I fixed it for the other 11 people," he said. "There's a 71-year-old woman in your class. She climbs 22 stairs every night, then has to sit and rest for 10 minutes before she can even begin learning. I sat in the hallway one evening and counted. There are 4 people in that building who have trouble walking, and none of them use wheelchairs. So none of them were counted as disabled in your complaint." He paused. "You think that elevator is a gift I gave you? It isn't. It's something that should have been working 3 months ago, and it wasn't, because 11 people taking an evening class weren't important enough for the city council to bother discussing." Lana said nothing. She sat beneath the streetlight with both hands still resting on the rims of her chair, trying to find something to throw back at him and finding nothing. And the worst part was realizing that she wasn't angry because he was wrong. She was angry because in 5 years, no one had ever said that to her. I still don't want you coming here, she said at last. I know, he answered. Then he opened the car door, got in, and told Theo to drive. And he didn't look back at her once, and Lana remained there until the taillights disappeared completely at the far end of Congress Street. At 11 o'clock that night, in the house on the hill west of the city, Theo Rowan knocked on the door of Winston's study and entered carrying a thin folder. You told me to look into the scar, Theo said. Winston looked up. I couldn't get the hospital records, because medical records require a court order, so I went another way. I searched New York State Police traffic accident reports within about 25 miles of Troy, then filtered them against every date you were absent from the work logs 5 years ago. He placed the folder on the desk. There was one. Winston pulled it toward him. It was a copy of a New York State Police report from the Troy station, an injury accident form. The location was listed as Route 7, near the intersection with Brick Church. Vehicle involved: a small materials truck. Injured person 1. Male, approximately 30 years old. No identification. Transported to Samaritan Medical Center. Injured person 2. Female. Winston reached the date line, and his hand stopped. March 14th, 5 years earlier. It was the only 24 hours in his entire life that contained nothing he could remember. 24 hours he had always believed he had spent sick somewhere. 24 hours Julian had once explained by saying, "You had such a high fever you don't remember any of it." He turned to the second page, the witness statement section. There was a block of text 11 lines long, and on the very first line, where the witness's name should have been, there was a thick stripe of black ink covering it completely, so heavy that the paper beneath it had buckled. Winston sat motionless for a very long time. "Sir," Theo said quietly, "this isn't a public copy with personal information redacted. Public copies are redacted digitally. Someone took a black marker and covered this name on the original document in the archive." Winston placed a finger on the blacked-out line. "You don't black out the name of a witness," he said. "You black out the name of someone another person wanted erased." Winston didn't tell anyone about the black streak of ink. He locked the folder away in a drawer, told Theo to keep digging, and the following evening, he did something Theo had thought he would never do again. He went back to Halloran Community Center, but this time he didn't stand across the street by the curb. At 6:35, 5 minutes after Lana had begun class, the classroom door opened, and Winston Vitale walked in, took off his coat, and sat down at an empty desk in the last row. Everyone in the room turned to look. The unemployed house painter stared longer than the others. Lana stood motionless at the front of the room for 3 seconds, and she had exactly 3 choices, every one of which would force the other 11 people to witness something that had nothing to do with them. So she chose a 4th. She continued teaching. Winston stayed until 9 o'clock. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at her in a way that would make anyone else notice. He opened the workbook they had handed out and followed along, and when Lana passed his desk during individual practice, she glanced down and saw him working through basic algebra, 1-variable equations, and he had gotten the second problem wrong. He came back the next evening, then the evening after that. By the 4th night, no one in the class turned around to look at him anymore, and the woman who worked the night shift at the warehouse had asked to borrow his eraser. By the 6th night, Dale Prentice had moved down to sit at the same table with him, and Lana caught fragments of a conversation about forklifts. Lana didn't know what to do with any of this. She had prepared herself for him knocking on her door, for him offering money, for him sending flowers or sending lawyers, and she had an answer ready for every one of those things. She had no answer for a man who sat quietly in the back row and did his homework. On the 8th evening, after class had ended and everyone else had gone, she picked up his workbook and looked through it while he stacked chairs. "You never finished high school," she said. "It wasn't a question. You dropped out when you were 15. "I know." She set the workbook down. "Back then you told me you'd go back. You said once things settled down, you'd get your diploma." "I remember. It's been 11 years, she said, and she meant for the words to come out cold, but they didn't. They came out almost like teasing, and both of them heard it. Winston stacked the last chair. Then he walked over to her table, reached into his coat pocket, and placed a book on the surface between them. Lana looked at it, and something inside her chest seemed to drop. It was a paperback novel. Its cover faded almost completely of color, its spine worn smooth and split across in 3 places, the back held together by a strip of clear tape that had yellowed with age, with another newer strip laid over it. All 4 corners of the cover had been rounded by years of friction. Inside, the pages were thicker than they should have been, because they had been wet and dried again more than once. "You kept it," she said. Winston didn't answer. He didn't explain how many places he had carried it through, didn't tell her that it had stayed in his pocket on nights when he had been afraid to sleep, didn't say anything at all about what keeping it had meant. He simply placed it there and stepped back. Lana opened it. On the first page, in the rounded, careful handwriting of an 18-year-old girl, there was one line. Read slowly. This book is longer than you think. She stared at those words for a long time. Then she turned the pages, and she saw pencil marks in the margins. Not the kind of notes a student would make. Underlined sentences, crooked question marks, and on one page near the end, 3 words written in the clumsy block letters of someone who wasn't used to writing. She didn't read them. She closed the book. Have you finished it yet? She asked. No. 11 years and you still haven't finished it? I read slowly, Winston said. You told me to read slowly, and Lana laughed. It escaped before she could stop it. A short, rough sound, almost nothing more than a hard breath, and she raised a hand to cover her mouth immediately, as though she had just dropped something and broken it. But the sound was already there. Winston stood looking at her, and he didn't smile back, didn't say anything, didn't step closer, because he understood very well that this moment was as thin as paper, and anything he did now might tear it. So he simply stood still. Lana lowered her hand. Her face had returned to normal, but something around her eyes hadn't. Go home, she said, and this time her voice didn't sound like a door closing. Walter is waiting to lock up. Winston put on his coat. He had reached the doorway when she called his name. Winston. He turned. She pushed the book across the table toward him with 2 fingers. Take it with you. You haven't finished it yet. He looked at the book. Then he looked at her. All right, he said, and he picked it up. And the way he held it made Lana turn her face away. Downstairs, Walter Grady was waiting at the foot of the stairs as he did every evening. He looked at the man coming down first, then looked up toward Lana waiting at the top, and he said nothing. But when he carried her down that night, he stopped at the landing to catch his breath a little longer than usual, and he said only one thing. He's been coming for 8 nights now, Miss Bennett. Then he continued down the rest of the stairs. On Thursday afternoon, Lana arrived at the center 2 hours early to grade practice exams, and the building was almost empty. She was sitting alone in the second-floor classroom when there was a knock at the door. 3 polite taps. The man standing in the doorway was close to 60, wearing a gray wool coat and holding a hat in one hand. He didn't step inside right away. He waited until she nodded, then entered, and he pulled out a chair across the table from her rather than sitting beside her. And every one of those details had been carefully calculated to make her feel safe, which was exactly why a chill ran down Lana's spine. Miss Bennett, he said, my name is Julian Ferraro. I think you've heard my name before. She put down her pen. No, sir. Then that's good. He smiled, and the smile looked genuinely warm. I raised Winston from the time he was 12. His father died. His mother had already left by then, and I was the one who brought him home. I think of him as my own son. He placed the hat in his lap. I didn't come here to frighten you. I came because I care about him. Lana said nothing. He's destroying himself, Julian said, his voice dropping lower. Do you know where he's been every evening for the past 3 weeks? He's been sitting at that desk doing 7th grade homework, while 4 people are waiting for him to make decisions about matters where, if he chooses wrong, someone pays the price. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't eat. He's missed 2 meetings that no one has missed in 40 years. He looked at her. I don't blame you. I know you didn't invite him here. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out 2 things, placing them neatly on the table side by side. The first was a bank check, a certified check, already made out to Lana Bennett. The amount was $200,000. The second was a stapled packet of papers. Lana didn't need to pick it up. She recognized the logo in the upper left corner immediately, because she saw it every month on the envelopes that arrived at home. It was the file from Cedar Hill Adult Daycare Center, where Grandma Nora went 4 days a week, and the top page was her most recent neurological assessment, something only 3 people in the world were authorized to see, and Lana was one of those 3 people. Your grandmother is in stage 2, Julian said gently. When she reaches stage 3, you won't be able to care for her by yourself anymore. You'll need residential care. In this county, the decent places run $9,200 a month. The places her health insurance covers have 3 staff members for every 40 beds. He pushed the check slightly closer. This is enough for 4 years. Lana looked at the 2 papers. What do you want? Nothing, Julian said. That's what I want. Nothing. He rested both hands on his knees and leaned forward slightly. He's going to ask you things, Miss Bennett. He's going to ask about 5 years ago. He's going to ask whether you know anything. He paused. You've been silent for 5 years. Keep it that way. There was no sound in the classroom except the heater inside the wall. Lana could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. What do you know? She asked. Julian didn't answer that question. He simply looked at her with a sad, patient expression. The face of a man who had sat in rooms like this many times before, and always won by waiting. Lana picked up the check. She held it in both hands and stared at the number for a long time. Long enough that Julian leaned back slightly and let out a breath. Then she placed it on the table, turned it 180 degrees, and pushed it back toward him. She pushed the file along with it. "Get out of my classroom," she said. Julian didn't get angry. That was what Lana would remember for years afterward, that he didn't get angry at all. He only nodded slowly, like a teacher who had just heard a student give the wrong answer, but a brave one. Then he picked up the check and the papers, slipped them back into the inside pocket of his coat, put on his hat, and stood. At the doorway, he turned back. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you're a decent person. I truly mean that. I only regret that you're being decent at exactly the moment when it won't help anyone." Then he left. 3 days later, on Monday morning, the director of Halloran Community Center called Lana into her office and closed the door. The woman had already been crying before Lana came in. The county's adult education grant fund had just announced that it was withdrawing all funding for the evening program, effective immediately, citing a restructuring of priorities. The private funding organization behind the grant withdrew its support on the same day. There had been no 30-day notice as required by the contract, because the contract contained a clause allowing termination without cause, and in 14 years, no one had ever used that clause. The evening class was canceled. The instructor position was eliminated. The director said she had called 3 different offices, and no one could explain anything, that she was sorry, that she was truly sorry. Lana sat still and listened to all of it. Then she thanked her, wheeled herself out of the office, went all the way down the first-floor hallway, and stopped in front of the elevator doors that had been repaired only 12 days earlier. Lana didn't tell anyone about the man in the gray wool coat. She didn't tell anyone that she had lost her job either, and when Winston messaged her that evening to ask about class, she replied that the program had been temporarily suspended for administrative reasons, and it was the first time she had lied to him since he came back. On Wednesday night, at 8:15, Winston's car was waiting at a red light at the corner of 5th and Federal. Theo Rowan saw it first, a dark pickup truck with no license plates pulling into the right lane behind them a little too fast. And he hit the gas before he had time to think. 3 shots. The rear passenger window turned into a cloudy white web and collapsed inward. The windshield cracked diagonally from the lower corner upward, and the pickup turned left at the next intersection and disappeared into the old industrial district. Theo drove another 3 blocks before stopping. "Are you all right?" Winston brushed shards of glass from the shoulder of his coat. There was a long scratch across the back of his hand. "That was all. I'm fine," he said. "This wasn't meant to kill me." Theo looked back at him through the mirror. "If they wanted me dead, they would have chosen another place, another time, and you wouldn't have had time to hit the gas." Winston looked out through the empty window frame. "This was meant to keep me busy tonight." He pulled out his phone. No one answered at apartment 307. He called a second time. Then he said 2 words to Theo, and Theo turned the car around in the middle of the street. It took them 14 minutes to reach 9th Street. The door to apartment 307 was partly open. The lock itself was intact, but the door frame around the latch had been pried apart. The lights were still on inside. Winston went in first. The living room had been torn apart. The underside of the armchair had been slashed open. The stack of mail from the dining table had been scattered across the floor, and water was running in the kitchen. Lana was there, sitting in her wheelchair with her back to the doorway, and Grandma Nora sat in a chair beside her holding a glass of water, completely calm. "She's fine," Lana said without turning around. "She didn't come home until after they were gone. I took her to Cedar Hill this afternoon and picked her up at 7. She was controlling her voice very well. She thinks they were plumbers." Winston crossed the living room and went into the bedroom. The low dresser against the wall had been emptied completely. The top 3 drawers had been overturned onto the floor, clothes scattered everywhere. The bottom drawer lay in the middle of the room, pulled entirely out of the frame and turned upside down. Lana had followed him. She stopped in the doorway. Then she moved past him, went to the drawer, and bent down to turn it over. There was nothing underneath. She turned it over a second time. Then she reached beneath the dresser and swept her hand through the empty space, before drawing it back and sitting upright again. Winston saw her face then. He had seen a great many faces in his life, and he knew the difference between someone who had just lost a possession and someone who had just lost something they couldn't admit existed. "What's missing?" he asked. Lana backed her wheelchair away slightly. "Papers," she said. "Just household papers. Insurance. The lease." "Lana, I already told you." He didn't ask a third time. He stood there looking at the empty drawer, and something very small had just fallen into place in his mind, and he put it away for later. At 11 o'clock that night, 3 cars left 9th Street. Grandma Nora sat in the back seat of the second car with a blanket over her, and she asked Lana where they were going, and Lana told her they were taking a little vacation for a few days, and she nodded and fell asleep before they were out of the city. The house stood on a hillside west of town, about 20 minutes from Troy, behind an iron gate and a private drive a little over half a mile long. Winston had ordered a ramp built at the front entrance, starting at 3 that afternoon, 5 hours before the glass in his car shattered, and Lana noticed it the moment she was pushed up it. She said nothing about it. Inside, 2 women who worked in the house took Grandma Nora to a room on the first floor, the only room in the house without a step at the entrance. Lana stayed in the living room. She sat alone in the middle of that room for 10 minutes and looked around. The ceiling rose nearly 16.5 feet. A curved wooden staircase swept up to the second floor. Paintings hung on the walls, the kind she knew were real because each one had its own light. The solid stone fireplace was as wide as her entire kitchen at home. There wasn't a single book left out anywhere. No photographs. Nothing that suggested anyone actually lived there. Winston came in with his phone still in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her looking around. "If you need anything, tell them," he said. Lana turned her wheelchair to face him. "Is this what you traded 11 years for?" Winston didn't answer. "I'm really asking," she said, and there was no sarcasm in her voice, which made it worse. "I'm not trying to take a shot at you. I'm just trying to understand. 11 years, a house no one seems to live in, and tonight, someone shot out your car windows while someone else pried open my door. What did you trade for what?" He stood there for a very long time. "I don't know," he said at last. Then he turned away and walked toward the study, and Lana remained alone beneath that ceiling nearly 16.5 feet high, thinking about the yellow envelope she hadn't opened in 5 years, the original hospital discharge notice, and the anonymous warning Julian's men had left behind, proof of the silence she had kept for half a decade, now stolen to erase the final trace of what had really happened. On the first day, Lana woke at 6 o'clock out of habit and had nothing to do. There was no class to prepare for, no bus to wait for, no one who needed her to be carried up to the second floor. She sat at the large dining table in a house that wasn't hers and transcribed 3 audio files in a row, and by noon there was nothing left in her queue. Grandma Nora adapted within 4 hours. She called the 2 housekeepers by the names of 2 old friends, complimented the fireplace, and told Lana that this vacation house must be very expensive. "Sweetheart, don't book it for too long." Winston came home at 10 o'clock that night. He didn't tell her where he had been, and Lana didn't ask, and that became the unspoken agreement between them for all 3 days. On the second day, freezing rain came down. The electricity flickered twice, and during the second outage, when the whole room went dark for about half a minute, Grandma Nora panicked and called for her husband. Winston was in the kitchen. He reached her before Lana did, sat down in the chair beside her, and he didn't tell her that her husband was dead, nor did he lie and say he would be home soon. He told her that it was raining outside and the roads were slippery, that people would be driving more slowly than usual, and that she should stay there with him where it was warm. Grandma Nora calmed down within a minute. Lana stood in the doorway watching and didn't go in. That evening after dinner, the 2 of them sat in the living room while ice struck the windows outside. Winston brought out the old novel and read, actually read, tracing the lines with his finger, while Lana sat about 13 feet away finishing the stack of tests from a class that no longer existed. After about 20 minutes, he read 1 sentence aloud and asked her what a word meant. She answered. He nodded and kept reading. Half an hour later, he asked again. By the 4th time, Lana wheeled herself closer, and they sat a little over 3 feet apart, and neither of them said anything about the fact that the distance between them had changed. On the 3rd day, in the afternoon, Lana was in the kitchen when Winston came in to wash his hands. He had just returned from outside, his coat wet, and he bent over the sink to clean the scratch on the back of his hand. And when he leaned forward, the collar of his shirt fell open slightly at the front. The ceiling light shone directly onto the spot. Just beneath his hairline was a raised white scar, about 1.5 inches long, curving slightly to the left near the end. Lana was holding a cup. She didn't drop it, but her hand began to shake, truly shake, the kind of trembling she couldn't control, and the water in the cup rippled all the way to the rim, and she had to set it down on the table with both hands. She didn't have time to look away. Winston had already raised his head and seen her reflection in the glass cabinet door in front of him. He turned off the faucet. Then he straightened, turned around, and he didn't move closer, and he didn't ask right away. He waited. He stood there with both hands still wet and looked at her. And the silence lasted long enough to become something with weight. And Lana sat inside it and felt it pressing down on both shoulders. "You've seen this scar before, haven't you?" he said. Lana looked down at the cup. "No, Lana." I said no. She spoke, and she heard her own voice drop away halfway through the word. "You startled me. My hands shake sometimes. It's the medication. You don't take any medication." She looked up, and for those 2 seconds, they stared directly at one another, and both of them knew exactly what had just happened. And both of them knew that the other knew too. Winston could have kept asking. He could have asked 10 questions, and by the third one she would have broken. He didn't. He took the towel, dried his hands, folded it, hung it back up, and said, "All right." That was all. Then he walked out of the kitchen. But at the doorway, he stopped with his back still turned to her and added one more sentence, his voice as low and calm as ever. "I'm not going to rush you. I want you to know I won't rush you." Then he left. Lana remained alone in the kitchen. She sat there for a very long time, her hand still resting on the cup, and the water inside had been still for a long while. That night, she didn't go to bed. She waited until both housekeepers had gone home. Waited until the television in Grandma Nora's room went quiet. Waited until the light beneath Winston's study door went out sometime close to 1 in the morning. Then she wheeled herself into the living room and stopped in the middle of the darkened space. Outside, the freezing rain had eased. She sat beneath the high ceiling without turning on a light, both hands folded in her lap, and stared toward the window where there was nothing to see. She stayed that way until 4 o'clock. She didn't cry. She didn't think in any clear order either. Didn't arrange sentences. Didn't rehearse what she would say. She simply sat there. And in that darkness, something was moving very slowly toward the surface. Something she had held down for 5 years with the full weight of herself. And for the first time she realized she no longer had enough strength to keep it buried. At 4:10, Lana wheeled herself to the front door and opened it. Cold air rushed inside, and she didn't turn back for a coat. She pushed herself outside, onto the top of the ramp he had ordered built 5 hours before the glass in his car shattered. And she stopped there, halfway down the slope, in the middle of the night, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. The door opened behind her less than 2 minutes later, and Winston stepped outside without a coat, and he didn't ask what she was doing out there at 4 in the morning. He simply walked down, sat on the concrete edge of the ramp a little lower than she was, and turned to look up at her. "Can I sit here?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then she was silent for about 30 seconds, and when she began to speak, her voice was even and clear, without stumbling, the voice of someone who had silently repeated these sentences in her mind thousands of times, until they no longer hurt in the ordinary way. "March 14th, 5 years ago, she said. "I was walking home from work. Back then I worked the afternoon shift at the bakery on Congress Street, and I still walked because it saved me $2 a day. 4:20 in the afternoon. I turned at the corner of 4th, and I saw you." Winston didn't move. 6 years, she said. "For 6 years, I didn't know whether you were alive or dead. I'd already stopped imagining I saw you out on the street. That ended in the 3rd year. So when I saw you, I didn't believe it. I stood there and counted to 10 before I started walking again." She stared straight ahead, not at him. "You were standing across the street near the curb with your back to the main road. You were talking on the phone. You weren't watching the traffic. I was about to call your name. I'd already opened my mouth." She paused for 1 beat. "Then I saw the truck. It was about 230 feet away, on the road feeding into Route 7. It was carrying building materials, with a tarp over the bed. That stretch had a speed limit of about 25 miles an hour because of roadwork." Her voice didn't change. It didn't slow down. "That's what I remember most clearly, Winston. Not the sound. Not the impact. The fact that it never hit the brakes. I watched it for 4 seconds, and it didn't brake once. No tires screaming. No brake lights. Nothing. I didn't have time to think. I ran. I ran across the street and pushed you." She said it without placing any more emphasis on those words than on the others. "I didn't save you. I want to make that clear. I didn't have time to choose. I just ran." She drew in a short breath. "You fell forward into the street on the other side. Your head hit the edge of the curb. I saw that. And then I didn't see anything else. I woke up at Samaritan. I don't know how many days later. My grandmother was sitting there. Back then she was still lucid. She had only just started forgetting little things here and there." She stopped. "A doctor came in, and he talked for a long time, and I remember I kept waiting for him to get to the important part, and it took me a while to understand that he had already said it. Spinal cord injury at the 10th thoracic vertebra. Complete. No recovery." She gave the smallest shrug. "I asked him about the other man. He told me a male patient had been brought in with me. Traumatic brain injury. Conscious now. Stable. He wasn't allowed to tell me the man's name. I lay there for 2 days, waiting for you to come down and see me. Only then did she turn and look at him. You never came. On the 3rd day, a man came into my room, she said. He was somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed. He brought flowers, asked how I was doing very politely, asked whether I was in pain. Then he sat down in the chair and told me 3 things. First, he said the other man had suffered a head injury and lost his memory of that period. He couldn't remember anything from those 24 hours. He couldn't remember why he was in Troy. Couldn't remember anyone pushing him. Couldn't remember anyone standing across the street. The doctor said that part wasn't coming back. Second, he told me the truck wasn't an accident. He didn't explain another word. He only said I'd stepped into the middle of something I didn't understand, and that people knew my face now. She paused longer this time. Third, she said. He told me my grandmother was 71 years old, living alone in the apartment on 9th Street, number 307. He said the number exactly. Then he told me that if I said one word to anyone about what happened on the afternoon of March 14th, my grandmother wouldn't live through the week. He didn't threaten me, Lana said. That's the part I haven't been able to explain to anyone for 5 years. He said it sadly, like he felt sorry for me. Then he left the flowers and walked out. She placed both hands on the rims of her wheelchair. 3 weeks later, I was discharged. I signed the paperwork to take over responsibility for my grandmother's care, got rid of my old phone number, and I didn't come looking for you. The wind moved across the hillside, and neither of them moved. I didn't lose my legs because of a traffic accident, Winston, she said. I lost my legs because I was standing in the middle of that road that afternoon, and I was standing in the middle of that road because you were there. Winston remained seated on the edge of the concrete and said nothing. He didn't ask the name of the man who had brought the flowers. He didn't ask about the truck. He sat there with both hands resting on his knees and waited, because there was something in the way she placed her hands on the rims of her wheelchair that told him she wasn't finished. There's one more thing, Lana said, and no one forced me into this part. She looked down at her hands. In the 2nd year, my grandmother started forgetting things. I went to a legal aid attorney, and they told me that a threat made 2 years earlier wasn't enough to do anything with. They said if I was truly afraid, I should report it. I didn't. In the 3rd year, I knew for certain no one was watching me anymore. I knew because I tested it. I changed the hours I went to work. I took different routes. I sat at the bus stop watching the street for 2 straight weeks. There was no one. No one cared about me anymore. She looked up, and I still stayed silent. I've had your address for 4 years. It wasn't difficult. All I had to do was ask the right person at a barber shop on 2nd Street. She said it with complete calm. I didn't stay silent because that man threatened me, Winston. I held on to that threat. I kept it like a permission slip. For 5 years, I told myself I wasn't allowed to speak, and I was able to sleep because of that. She drew in a breath, but the real reason was different. If you remembered, she said, if one day you remembered that someone had pushed you, you would have gone looking for that person. I know you. You would have kept looking until you found them, and you would have found me sitting in this. She placed a hand on the rim of her wheelchair. And you would have looked at me. For the first time all night, she stopped. I can endure a lot of things. I can endure pain. I can endure being poor. I can endure people stepping around me on the sidewalk like I'm not there. I couldn't endure that look. The look of someone who owes me. You would have stayed because of the debt. You would have been gentle because of the debt. You would have married me because of the debt. And I would have had to spend the rest of my life in a house, never knowing whether you stayed because of me or because of that afternoon on March 14th. Her voice still didn't rise. I'd rather have you forget me than pity me. She looked directly at him. I didn't sacrifice myself for you, Winston. I hid. I let you live for 5 years with a hole in your memory. I let you believe you'd been sick somewhere. I watched you come back here and spend a whole year looking for me. And I still didn't tell you. Not because I loved you. Because I was afraid of the way you would look at me. Then she fell silent. Winston remained completely still for several more seconds. Then he rose from the edge of the concrete, took 2 steps upward, and knelt down. The concrete was still slick with ice, and he wasn't wearing a coat, and he knelt there anyway, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers, exactly as he had that morning on River Street, and this time he didn't ask permission for anything. He lifted both hands and took hers, and he cried. There were no sobs. That man cried the way someone cries when he has never been allowed to cry before. His shoulders didn't shake. His face didn't twist. The tears simply kept running down, and he didn't wipe them away, and his hands gripped hers so tightly that Lana could feel the pain. She sat there and endured it, and she realized that this was exactly what she had spent 5 years running from, and it was nothing like what she had imagined. He cried for a very long time, long enough for the sky beyond the hills to begin changing from black to gray. Then he stopped, and the silence afterward was worse. He didn't let go of her hands. He remained on his knees, his head lowered slightly, breathing evenly. And he didn't say a single word for so long that Lana began speaking again, began saying that she was sorry, and he gave the smallest shake of his head to make her stop. He stayed silent a while longer. Then he looked up. "I came back here a year ago," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I came back to keep a promise I made to the girl I loved when I was 24. I was prepared to find out you were married. I was prepared for you to hate me. I was prepared for you to look at me like I was a stranger." His hands tightened around hers. "I spent a year looking for the girl I promised I would marry," he said. "I had no idea I was also looking for the woman who paid with her legs so I could still be alive to search for her." Lana couldn't answer. "You said you were afraid of the way I would look at you," he said. "You were half right. I owe you. I'll owe you until the day I die. And there is nothing in this world that can erase that debt." He looked directly into her eyes. "But you're wrong about the rest. I don't need to know who pushed whom that afternoon. I spent an entire night sitting outside your door before I knew any of this." He released her hands very slowly. Then he stood. He remained there for a moment, looking toward the far end of the private road leading to the gate. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, flattening into something very calm, and Lana felt a chill run down her spine because she had never heard him speak in that voice before. "You said the truck never hit the brakes," he said. "That man told you it wasn't an accident." "Yes." Winston nodded once. "Go inside. It's cold out here." Then he walked all the way down the ramp toward the garage, and 10 minutes later Lana heard a car start and drive through the gate while the sky was still dark. At 7 o'clock that morning, Winston called Theo and gave him 3 tasks. The first was to find the original accident report, not the archived copy. It took Theo a day and a half to come back with an answer. And the answer was that there wasn't one. The Troy Station's paper records from that period had been transferred to the county archive and digitized the following year. And the original paper files had been destroyed according to procedure, and in the digital version, the witness statement page simply didn't exist. It hadn't been deleted. The page wasn't there. The page numbers jumped from 3 to 5. The second task was Winston's own medical record, and that one was easy, because a patient had the right to request a copy of his own file. He signed the paperwork on Tuesday morning and received the records Thursday afternoon. He didn't read them himself. He took them to a neurology clinic in Albany and placed them on the desk of Dr. Helen Vance, 49 years old, a physician he had chosen because she had no connection whatsoever to anyone he knew. She read for 20 minutes and didn't ask him a single question about why he had come. "Closed traumatic brain injury, small subdural hemorrhage in the left temporal lobe," she said. "You were unconscious for 9 hours. Retrograde amnesia covering approximately 24 to 30 hours before the injury." She took off her glasses. "This isn't unusual. Your brain hadn't yet transferred what happened that day into long-term memory before the impact occurred. That part wasn't lost. It was never recorded in the first place, so it isn't coming back. There is no medication for it. No therapy." Winston nodded. "Thank you, doctor. I'm not finished." She pulled the file back toward herself. "Do you know how electronic hospital records work? Every time someone changes a data field, the system creates an audit trail. Who changed it? When they changed it? What they changed? The old content itself may be overwritten, but the audit trail remains." She turned the screen toward him. "The copy you received is the final printed record, but I asked the hospital to include the access log, because I always request it with older medical files." She pointed to 3 lines. "Your admission record was altered 3 times within the first 48 hours. The first change was the name field, from unidentified male patient to your name, normal. The second was the emergency contact field." She paused. "The third was the admission circumstances note. That field originally contained information. 41 hours after you were admitted, it was changed to blank. Who changed it?" "That's the problem," Dr. Vance said. "All 3 changes were made under the same employee identification code. That code belonged to a night shift charge nurse. She resigned 11 days later." She looked at him. "Mr. Vitale, I've been doing this for 23 years. People don't edit the admission circumstances field. No one cares about that field, unless there's something in it." The third task was the truck. That was the one that took Theo the longest, 9 days. The vehicle's license plate was listed in the accident report, and the plate was registered to a construction materials hauling company in Rensselaer, a company that dissolved 10 months after the crash. Theo didn't go looking for the company. He went looking for the insurance. Every accident involving injury generated a claim file, and a claim file contained the driver's name, because the driver had to sign it. It took him 6 days to identify the insurance carrier, and another 3 to find a former claims adjuster who had worked there. A retired man living in Colony who still kept copies of the cases that, in his words, made him sick to his stomach. This one was among them. He remembered it for 2 reasons. The first was that the insurance company paid the entire claim within 19 days, with no dispute and no negotiation. Something he said he had never seen happen once in 28 years on the job. The second reason was the driver. That bastard never apologized, he told Theo. I did this work all those years, and when somebody causes an accident that leaves another person paralyzed, they either cry or deny everything. This guy did neither. He just sat there, signed the papers, went home, like he was filling out customs forms. The name on the file was Curtis Bell. Theo placed the paper on Winston's desk Friday night. 61 years old. His commercial driver's license was revoked 4 years ago because he failed to pay the renewal fee. No permanent address since last year. He turned to the second page. I found him through his prescriptions. He's been filling high-dose opioid pain medication at a pharmacy on State Street in Schenectady every 2 weeks. Prescribed through the oncology department at Ellis Hospital. Theo looked up. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. He's staying at a weekly motel on Broadway. Room 9. They say he can't really go anywhere anymore. Winston stared at the paper for a long time. He didn't ask Theo who had paid for that truck, because he knew that if he asked that question now, Theo would answer with a name, and he wasn't ready to hear any name from someone else's mouth. You're going alone? Theo asked. Yes. Sir, if he agrees to talk, the statement of a dying man won't mean anything in court unless it's recorded. Winston stood and reached for his coat. Then bring the camera. Room number 9 was at the end of the second-floor hallway, and the door wasn't locked. Curtis Bell lay in bed with the blanket pulled up to his chest, and he was so thin that his cheekbones jutted sharply beneath the skin. On the table beside the bed were 3 medicine bottles and a plastic cup. He turned his head when Winston walked in, and he didn't ask who he was. He looked at him for several seconds, then closed his eyes and let out a long breath. I know your face, he said. Winston pulled over the only chair in the room and sat down. Theo stood at the foot of the bed, set the camera on top of the dresser, and switched it on. Do you mind? Winston asked. Curtis Bell looked at the tiny red light on the camera. No, he said. I've been waiting 4 years for this. Then he began to talk, and he spoke for 14 straight minutes without needing a single question, his voice breaking now and then when he ran out of breath, but never once hesitating. His name was Curtis Allen Bell, born in 1965, and he had driven trucks for 22 years. That February, he owed $47,000 in gambling debts to 3 different places, and one of those places had already started coming to his house. Someone approached him, not one of the creditors. A well-dressed man somewhere in his 50s who bought him coffee at a place on 5th Street. The man told him that every dollar of the debt would disappear, and there would be another $30,000 in cash on top of it, in exchange for one job, one afternoon, one stretch of road, one truck he wouldn't have to worry about registering or insuring. All he had to do was drive, and not touch the brakes. He told me nobody was going to die, Curtis Bell said. Those were his exact words. He said it was only meant to teach some kid that he shouldn't be wandering around out there by himself. He said just hit his legs, enough to put him in the hospital for a few months. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. I believed him. I needed to believe him, you understand. $47,000. He told the rest more quickly. How he had sat in a parking lot waiting for 40 minutes. How someone called him and told him exactly when to move. How, when he turned onto that stretch of road, he saw a woman running across the street, and he lifted his foot, meaning to hit the brake, and then he didn't. I didn't brake, he said. I had 4 seconds, and I didn't brake. That's the thing I carry with me. Not you. You're still walking. It's that girl. Winston sat perfectly still. Who paid you? He asked. Curtis Bell turned his head and looked at him. I don't know his name. I swear to you. He never told me. He took a breath, but I met him 4 times. The last time was in the hospital parking lot, when he gave me the rest of the money. He wore a felt hat, gray wool coat. He spoke very politely, asked me how I was feeling. He stopped. He called the man I was supposed to hit my boy. The room went silent. I asked him why, Curtis Bell said. That last time. I asked him why he'd do something like that to one of his own, and he sat there in the car looking outside for a while. Then he told me the kid was planning to throw everything away and come back here to marry some waitress. He said he'd spent 30 years building that house. He closed his eyes again. Then he said, put him in the hospital for a few months, and when he gets back on his feet, he'll think differently. Winston didn't move for the next 2 minutes. Then he stood, And he did something Theo hadn't expected. He pulled the blanket higher over Curtis Bell where it had slipped down from one shoulder. "Do you need anything?" he asked. The man in the bed opened his eyes and looked at him. And finally, he began to cry. "Tell her for me," he said. "Tell her I had 4 seconds." On the drive back, no one spoke until they were past Rotterdam. Then Theo spoke from the driver's seat. "Sir, there's one more thing. I meant to give it to you last night, but you'd already left." He reached toward the passenger seat and passed a hardbound ledger over his shoulder. "The visitor log from the gate at the house. Security keeps them for 7 years. I went through everything, from the day you came back up to now." Winston opened it. A sticky note marked a page near the end of the first quarter of the book. March 14th, 4 years earlier. Exactly 1 year after that afternoon. Not a day more. The entry was written in ballpoint pen at 10:40 in the morning. Female, wheelchair, no appointment. Requested face-to-face meeting. Entry denied. In the approval signature column were 2 initials and a surname, written in a slanted hand so familiar that Winston had seen it thousands of times on thousands of pages over the course of 23 years. J. Ferraro. Winston stared at the line for a long time. Then he turned back 1 page to the movement log for that day and found the entry recording the time he had left the house. 11:15. He had been in the study all morning. The study looked directly onto the front grounds. From that window to the iron gate was 50 feet. He closed the ledger and rested it on his lap. "Theo," he said. "Yes, sir." "Do you remember when I asked whether she was hard to find?" "I remember." "It took you 9 hours." Winston looked out through the window, and his voice didn't rise, didn't break. "And it took him 4 years, and he couldn't find her." He rested a hand on the ledger. "For the past 5 years, I haven't been the boss at all, Theo. I've been a puppet sitting in the chair." The call came at 2:10 the following afternoon. Cedar Hill Adult Daycare Center called Lana to confirm that Grandma Nora had been picked up at 1:45 under an emergency medical transfer order, bearing a notarized power of attorney clause, that the courier had presented valid legal identification, and that they were calling per protocol to confirm the discharge. Lana asked who had signed the authorization. The person on the other end read the name of an attorney in Albany Lana had never heard of. She hung up and sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then she called Winston. He listened to everything in 15 seconds and didn't ask her to repeat a single thing. "I know where she is," he said. "She's all right, Lana. He won't touch her." "How can you be sure?" "Because that's not how he works," Winston said. "She's leverage. Leverage has to stay intact if you want to use it." He paused for 1 beat. "Stay at the house?" "No." The warehouse by the river had 2 doors, and Winston entered through the side door as he always did. Inside, beneath the only light still burning, Julian Ferraro sat on a wooden chair with both hands resting on his knees, and he looked up when he heard the footsteps. There was no one else in the warehouse, not a single person. "The old woman is at a nursing lodge 12 minutes from here," Julian said immediately, without greeting him. "2 of my people are watching her. They're letting her watch television. She doesn't know anything. She thinks she's there for a routine appointment." He took a slip of paper from his pocket and placed it on the wooden crate in front of him. "That's the address. You can send someone to get her right now if you want." "I'm not keeping her." Winston didn't pick up the paper. "You know, don't you?" Julian said. "Yes." The 58-year-old man nodded, and there was nothing on his face that looked like fear, only exhaustion. "I spent 30 years building this house," he said. "Your father died because he was hot-headed. I picked you up out of his backyard when you were 12 years old, and you didn't shed a single tear. And I knew that day you were the one who could hold together what he had ruined." He looked at Winston. "Then 5 years ago, you called me from Chicago and told me you were done. You said you were coming back to Troy, marrying that girl, living a different life. You told me as if you were talking about the weather." His voice trembled slightly, then flattened again. "I didn't try to kill you. I never planned that. I only wanted you laid up for a few months, long enough to wake up and remember who you were." He opened both hands. "I didn't expect someone to run into the road." Winston stood there for a long time. Then he reached inside his coat and drew his gun. Julian didn't move. Winston didn't raise it. He held it in one hand, hanging at his side, walked over to the wooden crate, and set it down on the surface about a handspan from the slip of paper. Then he stood there with both arms hanging loose and looked at the gun resting on the wood. He knew every foot of this warehouse. 11 years earlier, he had slept in the far corner behind a stack of pallets for 3 months, and an 18-year-old girl had brought him bread every night after her shift and sat beside him reading aloud, because he read slowly. He had made his promise to her in this exact place. The sound of wheels moved across the concrete floor. Lana came through the side door alone, pushing her wheelchair, her hair wet from the rain. and stopped about 13 feet from the two men. She looked at the gun on the crate. Then she looked at Winston. "Winston," she said. He didn't turn around. "Look at me." He turned. And Lana spoke in a very calm voice, the same voice she used at the front of a classroom. "I didn't run into that road so you could become the thing that ran over me." The entire warehouse went silent. Winston stood there looking at her, and inside his head was everything 23 years had taught him, and all of it was saying the same thing, and it was simple, and it had always been the answer before now. He reached out. He picked up the gun. Then he removed the magazine, pulled back the slide, let the round in the chamber fall onto the concrete with a metallic clink, and placed all 3 pieces separately on the wooden crate. "Theo," he called. Theo stepped in through the doorway. "Call Attorney Delaney. Tell him to contact the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of New York, whoever is on duty tonight. Tell him I want a meeting before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." He turned toward Julian. "You stay here with Theo. No one touches you." Julian looked at him, and for the first time that entire evening, his expression changed. "What are you doing?" "I'm turning you in," Winston said. "I'm turning over everything. Over 2 decades of family records, names, accounts, all of it." He didn't raise his voice at all. "And I'm turning myself in too." Julian shot to his feet. "Do you understand what you just said? You go to prison. I go to prison. 40 people go to prison." "I know. For what?" Julian nearly shouted. And it was the only time in Winston's life he had ever heard the man raise his voice. "For that girl?" Winston looked at him. "Because I sat in that chair for 5 years and thought I was powerful," he said. "That chair couldn't protect a 76-year-old woman from a forged authorization form. It couldn't protect her from a truck. It couldn't protect me from you." He picked up the slip of paper with the address on it. "Anything that can't protect anyone isn't power, Father." Grandma Nora was brought back at 11 o'clock that night. She had dozed off in the car and woke when they reached the house, and she complained that the clinic had kept her waiting far too long that day. And Lana said, "Yes, Grandma, go get some rest." She never knew anything had happened. The agreement was signed on an April morning in a windowless conference room in Albany. Winston Vitale pleaded guilty to 2 federal charges, turned over the complete archives spanning decades of the family's illicit operations, and agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution. In return, he received 14 months in prison, the lowest sentence the prosecutor could recommend for someone in his position. Julian Ferraro was indicted on 19 counts, including hiring someone to inflict bodily harm, and he pleaded not guilty, and his trial lasted 11 months. Every illegal operation connected to the Vitale family ended within 6 weeks. 4 restaurants and 2 transportation companies were legitimate assets that had paid their taxes in full for 20 years, and the court allowed them to remain. Winston transferred all of them into a trust before entering prison, and the attorney read the name of the trust aloud before Winston signed. Bennett. On the morning he reported to begin his sentence, Lana drove him to the gate. She sat in the car with her hands resting on the rims of her wheelchair and said that 14 months really wasn't that long, and her voice faltered on the final word. Winston opened the car door, then stopped. "You waited 11 years for me," he said. "This time, let me be the one who waits." Then he went inside. Lana visited him every 2 weeks, exactly 40 minutes each time, and she never missed a single visit. Halloran Community Center reopened its evening classes in September, and by January of the following year, the building had a new name, Bennett Center. Lana Bennett became its director, and the first thing she did wasn't open more classes. She took out the 2 old complaints she herself had filed, the 2 complaints no one had ever answered, and used them as the model for creating a citywide accessibility review program for Troy. She went with an engineer and a representative from the County Disability Advocacy Organization, and over 14 months, they inspected all 211 public buildings, measuring every ramp, every doorway width, every button height. The program paid the full cost of renovations for places that couldn't afford them, asked for nothing in return, and put no one's name on a brass plaque. By the end of the second year, 37 buildings in Troy had new ramps, 19 locations had repaired elevators, and Route 11 had added 2 more evening runs. Walter Grady was put in charge of maintenance. At 74, he inspected every ramp once a month, using a wheelchair borrowed from the center, because he said measuring with a ruler didn't tell you a damn thing. One day, a local reporter asked him what he thought about the man who had paid for all of it. The man who had just gotten out of prison. Walter was tightening a bolt on a handrail. He didn't look up. "That boy had money, people, guns, everything," he said. "The bravest thing he ever did was get out of that chair." The wedding was held on a May afternoon in the backyard of Bennett Center. There was no church, no banquet hall, There were 83 people, including students from the evening classes, old neighbors from 9th Street, and Dale Prentice, in a borrowed suit, holding the birth certificate form he had filled out by himself for the first time in his life. Grandma Nora sat in the front row. That day, she couldn't remember the groom's name, but she knew something happy was happening, and she applauded from beginning to end. Lana wheeled herself down the ramp, the same ramp he had ordered rebuilt that winter before everything changed, with no one pushing her, her arms moving steadily around the rims. Winston waited at the bottom. When she reached him, he knelt down, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers, for the third time. Then he took the worn paperback from his pocket and placed it in her lap. "I finished it," he said. "It took 11 years. He took her hand. "I won't promise that I'll always know what to do. I promise I'll never decide for you what you can handle, and I'll never look down at you again. I'll stay at your eye level until the day I die." Lana looked at him for a long time. Then she spoke loudly enough for everyone in the backyard to hear. "I lost 5 years being afraid of being seen. I thought I needed to be fixed. I didn't." She placed a hand on the book. "I never needed to be healed. I only needed someone who knew how to look at me the right way." Lana never walked again. She didn't need to walk again for her life to have value, and that is exactly what this story is meant to leave behind. The first lesson is that a person's dignity doesn't live in their legs. It lives in whether the world around them is willing to make room for them, and sometimes a concrete ramp can give someone back more than any words of comfort ever could. The second lesson is that loving someone doesn't give us the right to decide for them how much they can endure, because when we take away another person's right to choose, we take away the most precious thing they possess. And the third lesson is that real strength isn't measured by what we are capable of destroying, but by what we are capable of protecting, even when protecting it means losing everything. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone you think may need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so another meaningful story can find its way to you each day. How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, have you ever met someone who truly knew how to see you for who you are? Or have you ever made a choice for someone you loved without letting them choose for themselves? Please leave a comment. We genuinely want to hear the things that live deepest in your heart. May you and your family always have good health, happiness, and peace in your lives each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.